Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Kia ora and welcome to another edition of Sigest. Today we're going to talk about the very lifeblood of humanity, the great base elixir that has powered civilizations over the millennia. That's right, we're going to talk about wine. But before you chug down that glass of Chardonnay, consider this. Our world-famous New Zealand wines may be under threat by our steadily warming climate. So is it time to panic, rush down to the supermarket and start stockpiling the Sauv Blanc? Or will we be forced to drink, for God's sakes, Fijoan wine? To answer these questions, we have Plant and Food's Damian Martin, who is the science group leader for grape and wine science. Good afternoon, Damian, and welcome to Sigest.
Afternoon.
So to begin with, I'm going to ask a little bit about you and how you started off in this industry.
Well, I sort of fell into wine. I was doing an OE and living in France and just had one of those kind of epiphanies in wine and felt I really need to know more about this, and just rocked up to Bordeaux University and said I'd like to enroll in a wine making course, and they said sure, and so that was really easy. And then the more and more I kind of learnt about wine, the more I became interested in I guess what you'd call the ecophysiology of growing grapes and making wine, the whole terroir story.
Yeah. So when people talk about terroir, I mean, can you just give us an easy definition for what that actually means?
Well, it's a combination of, I guess, the biology of the plant, the grapevine, the environment that it grows in, both above ground and below ground, and the management of the grapevine. And you can throw the winemaking on top of that, and you get that kind of sense of place that wines have. And it's something really interesting about grape growing and winemaking that I really enjoy, is how a wine can reflect the place and also the people that make them.
Yeah, and it's unusual for, I guess, a food or a drink to encompass all these kind of different variables. So it is a really interesting, unique product. So we keep hearing about, in terms of New Zealand wine, how unique it is. And is this just something that the marketers have used to sell more wine, or do we actually have something special in our wines here in New Zealand?
Well, New Zealand wines, and particularly New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc and more recently Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, have really hit a chord with the consumers globally. They have a distinctiveness which is associated with the combination of tropical fruit characters and green, kind of herbaceous, lively characters. And the two of those things together give the wine quite a unique flavour profile that doesn't seem to be matched by wines made elsewhere in the world.
Okay, so it's a combination of tropical with the fresh.
Yes.
Those two don't usually exist together.
No. Typically, a wine will have one or the other, be fruity or be on the greener spectrum. A lot to do with our environmental conditions in New Zealand, we think. Our wines are able to have that rather unique juxtaposition. Yeah.
So in terms of that, have you pinned it down to, like, for example, is it our weather that's driving this unusual flavour profile?
Yeah, it's a combination of our cool temperatures. So our wine regions right through New Zealand, you'd class as cool climate areas and very cool in some respects.
Sure, yeah.
But we have a lot of sunlight, and the sunlight has high energy. That sort of combination of high UV light and cool ambient temperatures helps, retain flavour, retain acidity in the fruit, and the wines keep that real lively, fresh character.
So we're kind of placed in a unique part of the world, I guess, in terms of the high UV, but the quite cool.
Yeah, in some ways it's comparable to a climate at high altitude, except we don't have the extreme cold or the extreme heat and the low humidity. So we have a temperate sort of oceanic climate, but associated with that high UV.
Okay, that kind of brings us quite neatly to the next, I guess, part of the podcast, which is talking about how climate change impacts on this. Now, the scientific consensus is pretty clear on this now. I think everyone except Donald Trump agrees that it's real and it's happening. And there's swags of evidence to support this, but just to quote one piece of evidence, which I found kind of quite compelling, was that 17 of the 18 warmest years on record, so this is 136 years of recording, have occurred since 2001. So that's just one piece of evidence to support climate change. So in terms of the wine story, are we starting to see the first signs of climate change in wine growing regions in New Zealand? Like, are we seeing these increases in temperature yet?
We're probably not seeing a consistent trend yet. The New Zealand wine industry is very concerned and very interested in the climate because it is so influential in terms of the style of wine we make. And we know from experience and in very warm vintages that we've had previously, 97, 98 was a particularly warm year, we know that it becomes difficult to make that sort of classic herbaceous style of wine that New Zealand is renowned for in those warmer conditions. So definitely keeping an eye on temperatures, and certainly for the production of Sauvignon Blanc, we can use those very warm years as a bit of a guide to what might happen, in a trend over a 20 or 30 or 50 year time frame. If we said there was a half a degree or a degree of average warming, that is equivalent to perhaps the warmest vintage we've experienced in New Zealand in the last 30 years.
Okay. So in terms of the flavour compounds, when it gets warmer, do some of these nice herbaceous flavours start to disappear from the wine, or does it start making off flavours? How does it work?
No, they don't. We don't make off flavours, but the style of the wine changes, and it's a bit like trying to compare wine, an Australian Sauvignon Blanc with a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. New Zealand has that real fingerprint of freshness and liveliness and greenness, which is really what attracts people to the wines. And so if we start to lose that, then we become more ordinary and less differentiated, and therefore the wines will, I think, become harder to sell.
Okay. Now, I guess a lot of people will be thinking, well, why don't you just grow them further south where it's cooler? Can we keep shifting production down as temperatures increase, or is it not so simple?
The wine industry is a bit tricky in that respect because, an international brand and the brand awareness for New Zealand is still based around one variety in particular at the moment. It's about 85% of our exports around the production of Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, right. And in particular from Marlborough. So the brand is Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, and they aren't really, those two sort of components of the brand aren't really interchangeable. So you might think you could just move a bit further south and strike a climate that was a bit cooler, which you probably could in a warming situation, but the market isn't looking for or isn't buying Canterbury Sauvignon Blanc at the moment. And likewise, you could change the variety to something that ripens a bit later, like Semillon, but it's the same challenge because the market isn't looking for Marlborough Semillon.
Okay. So it's kind of and I guess you've also got the soil involved in there as well. So the soils will be different, I guess, in different regions.
Absolutely. So and one of the things that I didn't mention before, but as part of our unique environment, New Zealand has a lot of young, quite fertile alluvial soils, which are extremely well suited to Sauvignon Blanc and also well suited to producing those lively herbaceous styles of wine.
So when we talk about climate change, I guess we talk a lot about the impacts on a global scale. Do we know what's likely to happen locally here in New Zealand in various regions, like, I don't know, the Hawke's Bay or Marlborough or something?
Well, we've been working in association with a European project that is actually taking global climate models, and the supercomputers that they use tend to produce sort of climate data at a grid resolution of, like a pixel, a 1 to 5 kilometre pixel on a map. And we've been taking that information, working with climatologists and people that specialise in the mesoclimate sort of adaptation, so smaller scale. So we're looking to downscale those climatic data to sort of 25 or 50 metre grid resolution. So it's more at the scale of the property. So a property can work out, what might be happening at various zones within it. And also we can work out, what the grape variety or varieties might be doing in those situations when they flower, when they go through colour change, and when the fruit might be ripening. And then we can work out the climatic kind of impacts.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of information is going to be really important for growers, definitely really relevant to them rather than a big sort of global scale.
Yes, I mean, the growers are interested in what's happening on their property and very close to home.
So is the sort of science around this evolved to the point where we can predict what a wine will taste like if the climate gets a degree warmer or rainfall increases by 50%? Is it?
Well, we can through the climatic warming, as I said, we can compare wines maybe made with the same variety in a slightly warmer climate. And it would be very interesting actually as a research project to use some of our grape growing and winemaking techniques in a warmer climate. And just see what the wines are like. So we basically transpose what we do in New Zealand to somewhere a bit warmer and see what it looks like. The second part of that equation is more challenging around how we might cope with the other pressures associated with climate change.
So what sort of research is your group doing to sort of help the growers out at the moment? Are there growers that are adopting practices to deal with these sort of things in the future?
Well, viticulture in New Zealand has been evolving quite a lot over the last probably 30 years. We went through a phase, and this was all based on kind of research where a lot of leaf removal was done, particularly in Sauvignon Blanc, because it was good for disease control, reducing humidity in the bunch zone and keeping bunch rots down. But as part of that kind of process, we learnt that maybe the flavour development wasn't quite so good for our style of wine when the bunches got too much sun. So we've circled back and leaf plucking less these days, and certainly modifying, I guess, what we call the microclimate of the bunch within kind of a given local climate is a way of either trying to mitigate or offset warming.
Yeah, so sort of shading the bunch of grapes.
Shading the bunch, and even having a bit more leaf-on-leaf shade within the canopy. These things do help and do modify the flavour profile of the wines that are made.
So I guess in your position, you have quite a lot of contact with growers and stuff. Do you think that most of them now accept the climate change is happening? Are they on board with all this?
Well, as I said before, I think the industry as a whole is paying very close attention to climate change, and most growers and most wine companies that I talk to, it's a topic of considerable interest for them. The upside is that we have time. So New Zealand is an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We're surrounded by quite a cool ocean, so we are likely to experience a more slowly warming climate than perhaps more continental wine regions in Europe or North America and South America or Australia. So we're quite lucky that I think we've got quite a bit of time to adapt as the climate warms, which we're pretty certain that it will. The question is just how much.
Yeah, sure. Do you think also, just in following on from that, do we have a bit of advantage being a young industry where we've kind of embraced innovation around producing wine rather than maybe a more traditional industry based in Europe? Is there some truth to that?
We are very fortunate in that respect, both because we have the freedom to change, so we don't have a regulatory kind of framework that actually prevents us from innovating, which is part of, I think, what constrains innovation in the grape and wine industry in Europe. And we have just basically a culture of innovation right through agriculture and horticulture in New Zealand. We are early adopters.
We are, yeah. Screw caps on wine.
Absolutely.
Classic example. So I guess with all things, there's always a flip side. So will there be new opportunities open up as a result of climate change? As we get warmer, will we have different varieties being grown, for example?
Oh, absolutely. Because one of the things New Zealand, I think, would really benefit from is being able to choose from a wider range of red varieties to grow, make wine from and market. At the moment, most of the South Island, the choice is quite limited because the growing season's short. We can make great Pinot Noir, but to have a wider range of varieties and wine styles to choose from to be able to make and market will be a benefit in the future.
And I guess a warmer climate might mean we might start producing red wines and in greater quantities or different varieties.
I think so, and the industry would also benefit from having that sort of dual approach. So, we've got a world-renowned white wine. Our Pinot Noir is growing in reputation, but the export volumes are still quite small. We actually have a research program to try and sort that out with New Zealand Winegrowers Research Centre. But absolutely having the opportunity to produce more red wine. The world drinks more red wine than white wine, so it would be good to be on that bus.
It's a big market to get into, I guess. In terms of the genetics of grapes, there's not a lot of breeding done around grapes, are there? Because it's all about the variety, and it has to be a certain variety, and you can't really mess with it. Do you think climate change could be a bit of a driver to produce or breed for grapes which are more resistant to heat or more resistant to disease?
Climate change is certainly one of the areas that we could look to for varietal selection. And we may even still be able to do that within the grape variety itself. So looking at the natural kind of genetic differences, we call them clones. So there are a grape variety or a cultivar is made up of a whole lot of slightly different genetic types, and we may be able to find one that ripens a bit later or produces or retains flavour a bit better in a warmer climate. But also climate change and the associated kind of pressure from markets around reducing pesticide input, I think is very likely to lead to more and more breeding program and hybridization work around grapevines, because what was tolerable 20 years ago in terms of fungicide and pesticide applications, I don't think will be in 20 or 30 years' time.
Yeah, we're a lot more aware of what's going on our plants and what's going on our crops now than we were back then. And I guess there's a role that the people who buy the wine have to play as well in accepting new varieties or being a little bit more adventurous in what they buy at the supermarket.
Yes, that's true, but by the same token, a lot of the wines in Europe are not marketed with a varietal tag. And so maybe the future for New Zealand is that we can produce a red wine and a white wine from Marlborough or from Otago, and we don't necessarily have to be explaining to people or telling the people it's this particular grape variety. We just need to tell them what it tastes like and hope they try it.
Yeah, where it's from. Yeah. Okay, so I guess to sum up with, we're aware of this problem in the environment, and there are some steps being taken at the moment. Would that be a fair
Yes,
statement?
Yeah, we're certainly we're getting prepared, and a lot of the research we've done over the last 20 or 30 years looking at viticultural management in particular has prepared us very well to be able to adapt to climate change. And as I said before, we've got time to see this coming, so I think we do have time to modify and gradually change our practices so we can adapt.
Okay, that's about all we have time for today. I'd like to thank our guest, Damian Martin, for coming in today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
For uncorking some of the science behind New Zealand wines and decanting some of his knowledge about how climate change might affect your favourite tipple. As you can see from what he said, the challenges are pretty tough, but both the growers and the scientists are already looking for answers. And thank you for listening. Please make sure to post a review and subscribe to Sigest on iTunes. If you have any comments or suggestions on what you'd like to hear on these podcasts, You can email us on sigest@plantandfood.co.nz.